The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as guard Thomas Mitchell took his position at the main gate. At 28 years old, Thomas had spent 6 years perfecting the art of standing perfectly still, his red tunic immaculate, his expression unchanging no matter what happened around him. The tourists loved taking pictures with the guards, often making faces or telling jokes, trying to get even the smallest reaction. Thomas had learned to tune it all out, focusing instead on the weight of responsibility that came with protecting one of the most important buildings in the world. But this Tuesday morning in March would be different from all the others. Thomas noticed her first in his peripheral vision, a small girl with a bright pink headscarf wrapped around her head, walking slowly with what appeared to be her parents. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old, and, even from his position, Thomas could see she moved with the careful steps of someone much older, each movement deliberate and measured. The family approached the gate where Thomas stood guard. The mother, a woman in her 30s with worried eyes, held the little girl's hand gently. The father walked slightly behind them, carrying a small backpack that seemed to contain medical supplies. As they got closer, Thomas could hear their conversation, though he remained perfectly still, staring straight ahead as his training demanded. "Look, Emma," the mother said softly, "there's one of the Queen's guards. Remember how we talked about them on the way here?" The little girl, Emma, looked up at Thomas with eyes that seemed far too wise for someone so young. Her face was pale, but her smile was bright and genuine. "Mummy, he's so tall," Emma whispered, not taking her eyes off Thomas. "Do you think he knows the Queen personally?" Her voice had a slight rasp to it, the kind that comes from medical treatments that are too harsh for such a small body. Thomas wanted desperately to look down at her, to acknowledge her presence, but years of training held him in place. The guards of Buckingham Palace were not supposed to interact with tourists. They were living statues, symbols of British tradition and discipline. Breaking character was not just discouraged, it was forbidden. The family stood near the gate for several minutes, and Thomas could feel Emma's eyes on him the entire time. She wasn't like the other children who visited. She wasn't trying to make him laugh or break his composure. Instead, she seemed genuinely fascinated by what he represented, the strength, the dedication, the unwavering commitment to duty. "Can I touch his coat?" Emma asked her mother quietly. "It looks so soft and warm." "No, sweetheart," her mother replied gently. "The guards have to concentrate on their work. We can look, but we shouldn't bother them." Thomas felt his heart tug slightly at the exchange. There was something about this little girl that was different. Maybe it was the way she spoke with such maturity, or perhaps it was the obvious care her parents took with every movement she made. Whatever it was, Thomas found himself fighting the urge to break protocol for the first time in his career. As the minutes passed, more tourists gathered around the area, taking pictures and making the usual attempts to get reactions from Thomas. But his attention kept drifting back to Emma, who had found a spot on a nearby bench where she could watch him without getting in anyone's way. Her parents sat beside her, and Thomas noticed how they constantly checked on her, adjusting her scarf when the wind picked up, offering her water from a bottle they kept close at hand. Through conversations he overheard, Thomas began to piece together Emma's story. She was visiting London with her parents as part of a wish program for children with serious illnesses. They had traveled from their home in northern England specifically to see Buckingham Palace because Emma had always been fascinated by the royal family and their guards. She had been battling leukemia for over 2 years, and this trip represented a brief break from the endless cycle of hospital visits and treatments that had become her normal life. The realization hit Thomas like a physical blow. This wasn't just any tourist visit, this was likely one of the most important days in this little girl's life, and he was a central part of making it special. Yet here he stood, unable to even acknowledge her presence because of rules and regulations that suddenly seemed incredibly small compared to what she was facing. As his shift continued, Thomas noticed that Emma never got tired of watching him. While other tourists came and went, snapping quick photos before moving on to the next attraction, Emma remained on her bench, studying his every detail with the intense focus that only children possess. She seemed to be memorizing everything about him, the way he held his rifle, the precise angle of his tall black hat, the shine on his boots that reflected the afternoon sun. During a brief moment when the crowd thinned, Thomas could hear Emma talking to her parents about him. "He must be very brave," she said thoughtfully. standing there all day, protecting everyone. Do you think it gets scary sometimes, being responsible for keeping people safe? Her father's voice was gentle as he replied, I think being brave means doing what's right even when you are scared, Emma. Just like you do every day. The simple wisdom in that exchange made Thomas's chest tighten with emotion. Here was a child who understood courage better than most adults ever would, and she was recognizing something in him that he sometimes forgot about himself. His job wasn't just about following rules and maintaining traditions, it was about being a symbol of protection and strength for people who needed to believe that someone was watching over them. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas began to notice other details about Emma's condition. She tired easily, often leaning against her mother when she thought no one was looking. Her parents were constantly vigilant, watching for signs that she might need to rest or take medication. Despite this, Emma's enthusiasm for being at the palace never wavered. She asked endless questions about the history of the guards, the different ceremonies they performed, and whether they got to meet the royal family. The guard change was scheduled for 4 o'clock, which meant Thomas's shift would end soon. As that time approached, he found himself dreading the moment when he would have to walk away from his post, leaving Emma behind. In all his years of service, he had never felt such a personal connection to someone on the other side of the gate. There was something about her dignity in the face of such a difficult battle that made him want to do something, anything, to acknowledge her courage. When the time came for the changing of the guard ceremony, Thomas executed his movements with the same precision he had practiced thousands of times before. But, as he prepared to march away from his post, he made a decision that would change both his life and Emma's forever. For just a moment, as he passed by the bench where she sat watching, Thomas allowed his eyes to meet hers directly. The smile that spread across Emma's face in that instant was like sunshine breaking through clouds. It was a smile that said she understood the significance of that moment, that she recognized the risk he had taken just to acknowledge her presence. In her eyes, Thomas saw not just gratitude, but a kind of understanding that passed between two people who recognized courage in each other. As Thomas marched away with his unit, he could hear Emma's excited whisper to her parents, "Did you see that? He looked right at me. He really saw me." The joy in her voice made Thomas's decision feel like the most important one he had ever made, even though he had no idea how much trouble it might cause him. That evening, as Thomas returned to his quarters, he couldn't stop thinking about Emma. Her face, her brave smile, the way she had watched him with such genuine admiration, it all stayed with him as he tried to sleep. He had broken a fundamental rule of his position, but somehow it felt like the most right thing he had ever done in his life. He had no way of knowing that this was only the beginning of a story that would capture the attention of people around the world, or that his simple moment of human connection would become something much bigger than either he or Emma could have imagined. All he knew was that tomorrow, he would be back at his post, and Emma would be continuing her battle with the same courage she had shown him that day. 3 weeks after that first encounter, Thomas had almost convinced himself that his momentary break in protocol had been forgotten by everyone except him. He continued his duties with the same dedication as always, but something had changed inside him. The rigid rules that had once felt like a protective structure now sometimes seemed like barriers that prevented him from connecting with the people he was meant to serve and protect. He was stationed at the same gate on a cloudy Thursday afternoon when he saw a familiar figure approaching through the crowd of tourists. Emma was back, but this time she looked different. The bright pink headscarf had been replaced with a softer blue one, and she moved even more slowly than before. Her parents flanked her on both sides, their faces showing the strain of whatever had happened in the weeks since their last visit. Thomas felt his heart rate increase as Emma's family made their way to the same bench where they had sat before. This time, however, Emma seemed to have less energy for watching the changing ceremonies and taking in all the sights around the palace. Instead, she focused almost exclusively on Thomas, as if his presence provided some kind of comfort or stability in what was clearly a difficult time. Through bits of conversation he overheard, Thomas learned that Emma's condition had worsened since their last visit. The treatments were becoming more aggressive, and the side effects were taking a heavier toll on her small body. Despite this, her parents had brought her back to the palace because it was one of the few things that still brought her genuine joy. "I wanted to see my guard again," Emma told her mother in a voice that was quieter than it had been before. "I kept thinking about him during the hard days at the hospital. It helped me be brave like him." Hearing those words nearly broke Thomas's composure entirely. The idea that this little girl had drawn strength from him during her most difficult moments was both humbling and overwhelming. He realized that their brief connection had meant as much to her as it had to him, perhaps even more. As the hours passed, Thomas noticed that Emma's parents were having quiet, serious conversations that stopped whenever she came within earshot. The kind of conversations that adults have when they're trying to protect a child from information that might frighten them. Thomas had heard enough similar conversations among military families to recognize the weight they carried. During a lull in tourist activity, Emma's mother approached the area near Thomas's post, ostensibly to take a photo but clearly with another purpose in mind. She stood where she knew Thomas could hear her, even though he couldn't respond, and spoke in a voice just loud enough for him to catch her words. "Thank you," she said simply, looking directly at the camera in her hands rather than at Thomas. "What you did last time, looking at her like that, it's meant everything to Emma. She talks about it all the time. In a world where so many people look away from children who are sick, you saw her for who she really is, a brave, wonderful little girl." Thomas felt tears threatening to form in his eyes but forced himself to maintain his composure. The mother continued, her voice getting slightly thicker with emotion. "We don't know how much time we have left together, but knowing that someone like you thinks she's special enough to break rules for, well, it gives her something to hold on to when everything else feels uncertain." The implications of her words hit Thomas like a physical blow. This wasn't just about a sick child getting better, this was about a family facing the possibility that they might lose their daughter. And, somehow, his small act of acknowledgement had become a source of strength for them during the darkest period of their lives. As the afternoon progressed, Thomas found himself acutely aware of every moment Emma was there. He memorized the way she sat on the bench, her small hands folded in her lap, her eyes never leaving his face for long. He noticed how her father kept checking his watch, probably timing her medication schedule, and how her mother constantly adjusted Emma's position to make sure she was comfortable. When it came time for the changing of the guard ceremony, Thomas faced a difficult decision. He had already broken protocol once, and doing it again would be an even more serious violation. But, looking at Emma's hopeful face, seeing the way she perked up slightly in anticipation, Thomas knew he couldn't disappoint her. As the ceremony began, Thomas performed his duties with extra precision, as if he were putting on a special show just for Emma. Every movement was sharp and deliberate, every step perfectly timed. He could see from his peripheral vision that Emma was completely absorbed in watching him, her fatigue temporarily forgotten in her fascination with the ritual. When the moment came to march past her bench, Thomas made his second deliberate choice to break the rules. But, this time, he went further. As he approached Emma's position, he executed a subtle but unmistakable nod in her direction, a gesture so small that most observers would miss it, but clear enough that Emma would understand it was meant specifically for her. The reaction was immediate and extraordinary. Emma's face lit up with a joy so pure and intense that several nearby tourists turned to see what had caused such happiness. She clapped her hands together softly and whispered something to her parents that made them both tear up immediately. But Thomas wasn't the only one who noticed what had happened. Standing among the crowd of tourists was another figure in uniform, Sergeant Major William Crawford, one of the senior officers responsible for maintaining discipline among the guards. His expression was stern and unmistakably disapproving as he watched Thomas march away with his unit. Thomas knew immediately that he was in serious trouble. Breaking protocol once might have been overlooked as a momentary lapse in judgment, but doing it again, and more deliberately, was going to have consequences. The military took discipline seriously, especially when it came to the prestigious position of palace guard. Thomas could face anything from a formal reprimand to being removed from his post entirely. As his shift ended and he prepared to face whatever disciplinary action awaited him, Thomas found himself surprisingly at peace with his decision. Yes, he had broken the rules, and yes, there would likely be consequences. But, seeing Emma's joy, knowing that he had provided a moment of happiness during what might be some of the last weeks of her life, that seemed far more important than any regulation or protocol. That evening, as expected, Thomas was called into Sergeant Major Crawford's office. The conversation was brief and to the point. Crawford had witnessed Thomas's breach of protocol and was required to file a formal report. Thomas would face a disciplinary hearing within the week, and, depending on the outcome, he could lose his position as a palace guard. "Explain yourself, Mitchell," Crawford said, his tone leaving no room for casual explanation. "You know the rules about interaction with tourists. You've been trained extensively on the importance of maintaining proper protocol. What could possibly justify your behavior?" Thomas thought carefully before responding. He knew that any explanation he gave would sound like an excuse, and that military discipline didn't typically make allowances for emotional decisions, no matter how well-intentioned they might be. "Sir, there are no excuses for my actions," Thomas replied formally. "I broke protocol knowingly and deliberately. I accept full responsibility for my choices and any consequences that result from them." Crawford studied Thomas's face for a long moment, perhaps looking for signs of remorse or attempts at justification. When he found neither, his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "This isn't like you, Mitchell," Crawford said more quietly. "In 6 years of service, you've never had so much as a minor infraction. Your record is exemplary. So I'm going to ask you again, what happened out there?" Thomas hesitated, then decided that honesty was his only option. He told Crawford about Emma, about her battle with cancer, about the way she had drawn strength from their connection during her difficult treatments. He explained that he understood the importance of military discipline, but that sometimes there were situations that called for a different kind of strength, the courage to choose compassion over compliance. Crawford listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When Thomas finished speaking, there was a long silence in the office. Finally, the sergeant major leaned back in his chair and sighed. "You realize this puts me in an impossible position," Crawford said. "I can't simply ignore a clear violation of protocol, regardless of the circumstances. The reputation and discipline of the guard unit depends on consistent enforcement of our standards." Thomas nodded. "I understand, sir. I'm prepared for whatever consequences are necessary." "The hearing is set for Monday morning," Crawford continued. "Until then, you're suspended from guard duty. I suggest you use the time to think carefully about whether this position is still right for you." As Thomas left the office, he felt a strange mixture of regret and satisfaction. He was sorry that his actions had put his career in jeopardy, but he couldn't bring himself to regret the moment of joy he had given Emma. If his military career was ending, at least it was ending because he had chosen to do something kind for someone who desperately needed kindness. What Thomas didn't know was that Crawford had not yet filed his report, and that he was struggling with his own difficult decision about how to handle the situation. Nor did Thomas realize that Emma's story was about to take a turn that would change everything for both of them. While Thomas spent his weekend contemplating the end of his military career, something unexpected was happening in Emma's household. Her mother, Sarah, had been so moved by the palace guard's kindness toward her daughter that she felt compelled to share the story with others. What started as a simple post on social media about their visit to Buckingham Palace quickly became something much larger than she had ever anticipated. Sarah's post was heartfelt and genuine. She wrote about Emma's battle with cancer, about how the little girl had found courage and inspiration in watching the palace guards, and about the extraordinary moment when one guard had broken protocol to acknowledge her daughter's presence. She included a photo of Emma sitting on the bench outside the palace, her face glowing with happiness, and described how that simple act of kindness had given Emma strength during her darkest days. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the post had been shared hundreds of times by friends and family members who were touched by Emma's story. By the next morning, it had been picked up by local news outlets who saw in it a perfect example of human compassion triumphing over rigid bureaucracy. The story resonated with people who understood that sometimes the most important rules are the unwritten ones about treating each other with kindness and dignity. As the story spread across social media platforms and news websites, public opinion began to form around the unnamed palace guard who had chosen compassion over protocol. Comments poured in from people around the world, praising his decision and criticizing any system that would punish someone for showing kindness to a sick child. The hashtag #BraveGuard began trending, with thousands of people sharing their own stories about small acts of kindness that had made enormous differences in their lives. Meanwhile, Thomas remained unaware of the growing public attention. He spent his suspended days walking around London, trying to process what his life might look like if he was no longer a palace guard. The military had been his entire adult life, and the thought of starting over in civilian work was both terrifying and strangely liberating. At least he would be free to interact with people normally, to show emotion and respond to situations with his heart instead of just his training. On Sunday evening, Thomas received an unexpected phone call from Sergeant Major Crawford. The conversation was brief but significant. Crawford informed Thomas that the disciplinary hearing had been postponed indefinitely due to external factors that needed to be considered. He instructed Thomas to report to the palace on Monday morning, not for the hearing, but to meet with senior officials who needed to discuss the situation with him personally. Thomas hung up the phone feeling more confused than relieved. The postponement suggested that something had changed, but Crawford's tone had been impossible to read. Thomas spent a sleepless night wondering what these external factors could be and whether they would work in his favor or make his situation even worse. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching Thomas's uncertain mood as he made his way to Buckingham Palace. Instead of being directed to the usual disciplinary hearing room, he was escorted to an office he had never seen before, where several high-ranking officials were waiting for him. The atmosphere was formal but not hostile, which gave Thomas a small measure of hope. "Guardsman Mitchell," began Colonel Patricia Hensworth, the senior officer present. "I'm sure you're wondering why your hearing has been postponed and why we've asked you here today instead." Thomas stood at attention. "Yes, ma'am." "Are you aware that your actions at the palace gate have become a matter of public interest?" she continued, her tone neutral but not unsympathetic. Thomas felt his stomach drop. Public attention was the last thing he had wanted, especially if it might embarrass the palace or the guard unit. "No, ma'am. I was not aware of any public interest." Colonel Hensworth gestured to a tablet on the desk, which showed Sarah's original social media post and some of the thousands of responses it had generated. Thomas read in amazement as complete strangers defended his actions and criticized the military for even considering punishment. The overwhelming sentiment was that he had done exactly what any decent person would do, and that punishing him would be a grave injustice. "As you can see," the colonel continued, "your situation has attracted considerable attention. We've received hundreds of calls and emails from members of the public expressing support for your actions. Several members of parliament have made statements criticizing any potential disciplinary action. The story has been covered by major news outlets not just in Britain, but internationally." Thomas felt dizzy as the implications sank in. His private moment of connection with a sick child had somehow become a global news story. "Ma'am, I never intended for any of this to become public. I was simply trying to do what felt right in the moment." "We understand that, Mitchell," replied another officer, Brigadier James Thornton. "Which is why we find ourselves in a rather unique position. On one hand, military discipline requires that protocol violations be addressed appropriately. On the other hand, punishing a soldier for showing kindness to a dying child would be a public relations nightmare for the palace and the military." The word dying hit Thomas like a physical blow. He had suspected that Emma's condition was serious, but hearing it stated so bluntly made the reality of her situation devastatingly clear. Whatever consequences he faced seemed trivial compared to what she and her family were enduring. Colonel Hensworth seemed to notice his reaction. "Yes, Mitchell, the little girl's prognosis is quite serious. Her parents have been very open about her condition in their media interviews. They credit you with giving their daughter hope and courage during an extraordinarily difficult time." "Media interviews?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Oh yes," the colonel replied, pulling up more content on the tablet. "Emma's parents have spoken with several news programs about their daughter's story and your role in it. They've been very careful to emphasize that they never asked you to break protocol and that they understand the importance of military discipline. But they've also made it clear that your gesture meant more to their daughter than we could possibly understand." Thomas watched a video clip of Emma's mother being interviewed on a morning news program. She spoke eloquently about her daughter's courage and about how the guard's acknowledgement had given Emma something precious during her battle with cancer, the feeling that she was seen and valued by someone she admired. The interviewer asked whether she thought the guard should be punished, and her response was immediate and firm. "Punish him for recognizing my daughter's humanity," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For giving a dying child a moment of joy? If that's wrong, then I don't understand what's right anymore." The room was quiet as Thomas finished watching the clip. He felt overwhelmed by the realization that his small action had taken on such enormous significance, not just for Emma but for thousands of people around the world who saw in it a symbol of choosing compassion over compliance. "So you see, Mitchell," Colonel Hensworth said finally, "we have a situation that goes far beyond a simple breach of protocol. The public has essentially adopted your case as a symbol of human decency, and any punishment we impose would be seen as institutional cruelty rather than necessary discipline." Brigadier Thornton leaned forward. "But we also can't simply ignore what happened. The integrity of the Guard unit depends on consistent standards and reliable adherence to protocol. If we make exceptions, even for sympathetic circumstances, we risk undermining the entire system." Thomas felt caught between relief that public support might protect him from severe punishment and anxiety about being at the center of such a large controversy. He had never wanted to become a symbol or a cause célèbre, he had simply wanted to acknowledge a brave little girl's presence in the world. "What does this mean for my position, sir?" Thomas asked. Colonel Hensworth exchanged glances with her colleagues before responding. "That's what we're here to discuss. We've been in communication with palace officials, military leadership, and government ministers about how to handle this situation appropriately. The consensus is that we need to find a solution that upholds military standards while recognizing that exceptional circumstances sometimes call for exceptional responses. We're prepared to offer you a choice, Mitchell," Brigadier Thornton added. "You can accept a formal reprimand in your record and return to guard duty with the understanding that any future protocol violations will result in immediate dismissal. Or, if you prefer, we can arrange a transfer to a different unit where your interactions with the public would be less restricted." Thomas considered the options carefully. Both allowed him to continue his military career, which was more than he had dared to hope for when he first received notice of the disciplinary hearing. But there was something else he needed to know before making his decision. "Sir, is there any possibility that I could see Emma again? I understand that it would have to be unofficial and wouldn't involve breaking any more protocols. But if her condition is as serious as you've indicated, I'd like her to know that her courage has inspired me as much as my actions apparently inspired her." The officers exchanged another series of meaningful glances. Finally, Colonel Hensworth smiled slightly, the first real warmth Thomas had seen in the entire meeting. "As it happens, Mitchell, Emma's family has specifically requested the opportunity to meet you properly. They understand that it would have to be arranged carefully and couldn't involve any official palace endorsement. But, if you're amenable, we believe such a meeting could be arranged through appropriate channels." Thomas felt his heart lift for the first time since his suspension began. The idea of meeting Emma face to face, of being able to speak with her and her family about what their connection had meant to both of them, seemed like the perfect resolution to an extraordinary situation. "I would be honored to meet them, sir," Thomas replied without hesitation. "Very well then," Colonel Hensworth said, standing to indicate that the meeting was concluding. "Take the rest of the week to consider our offer regarding your position. In the meantime, we'll work on arranging a proper meeting between you and Emma's family. I suspect it will be good for everyone involved." As Thomas left the palace that morning, his mind was spinning with everything that had happened. His simple moment of kindness toward a sick child had somehow become an international story about the importance of human compassion. More importantly, he was going to have the chance to meet Emma properly and tell her personally how much her courage had meant to him. What he didn't yet know was that the meeting being arranged would become the most significant moment of both their lives, and that Emma's story was about to take another turn that would affect them both in ways they never could have imagined. The meeting was arranged for the following Saturday at a private location away from the palace, a small conference room in a London hotel that had been chosen for its discretion and accessibility. Thomas arrived 15 minutes early, wearing his civilian clothes and feeling more nervous than he had during any military operation. This wasn't about protocol or duty anymore, this was about two human beings who had connected across a gap that neither had expected to bridge. When Emma's family arrived, Thomas was struck immediately by how small she seemed away from the grandeur of the palace. Dressed in a simple purple sweater and jeans, with a colorful knit cap covering her head, she looked like any other child her age, except for the careful way she moved and the unmistakable signs of someone who had been through extensive medical treatment. Her parents, David and Sarah, greeted Thomas warmly, their gratitude evident in their faces before they even spoke. But it was Emma who captured his attention completely. Up close, he could see that her eyes held the same intelligence and courage he had sensed from a distance, but also a wariness that no 7-year-old should ever have to carry. "Are you really my guard?" Emma asked as soon as the introductions were complete. Her voice was soft but direct, cutting straight to the heart of what mattered to her. Thomas knelt down to be at her eye level, abandoning any thought of formal military bearing. "I'm Thomas," he said gently. "And, yes, I was the guard you watched at the palace. But I think you're much braver than I could ever be." Emma considered this seriously for a moment, then smiled the same radiant smile that had first captured Thomas's attention weeks earlier. "Mummy says being brave means doing what's right even when it's scary. You did what was right when you looked at me, even though you weren't supposed to." The simple wisdom in her words, combined with the matter-of-fact way she delivered them, made Thomas understand why so many people had been moved by her story. Here was a child who understood courage not as an abstract concept, but as a daily choice between hope and despair, between connection and isolation. As they settled into comfortable chairs arranged in a small circle, Sarah began to tell Thomas more about Emma's journey. The cancer had been discovered 2 years earlier, when Emma was only 5. What had started as complaints about being tired had quickly escalated into emergency room visits, terrifying diagnoses, and a treatment protocol that was as harsh as it was necessary. "She's been through 3 rounds of intensive chemotherapy," David explained, his voice carefully controlled. "Each one harder than the last. We've had some good periods where she seemed to be responding well, but the latest scan showed that the cancer has spread more than we hoped." Thomas felt his chest tighten at the clinical way David delivered this devastating news. He could see the effort it took for both parents to remain composed while discussing their daughter's condition, especially with Emma sitting right there listening to every word. But Emma herself seemed remarkably untroubled by the conversation about her illness. Instead, she was focused entirely on Thomas, studying his face with the same intense attention she had shown at the palace. "Do you get scared sometimes when you're standing guard?" she asked him. "It seems like it would be scary to be responsible for protecting everyone." Thomas was struck by how she instinctively understood that fear and courage weren't opposites, but companions that often traveled together. "Yes, I do get scared sometimes," he admitted. "But I've learned that being scared doesn't mean you can't do your job. It just means you have to do it anyway." Emma nodded solemnly, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. "That's exactly how I feel about my treatments. They're really scary, and they make me feel terrible, but I do them anyway because that's how I fight the cancer." The parallel she drew between his military duty and her battle with illness was so profound that it left Thomas momentarily speechless. This little girl had somehow understood that they were both soldiers in their own ways, both fighting battles that required them to show up every day regardless of how they felt. Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a tablet, showing Thomas videos and photos from Emma's treatment journey. There were images of her in hospital beds, hooked up to machines that looked far too large and complicated for such a small patient. But there were also pictures of her laughing with nurses, playing games during long infusion sessions, and maintaining the kind of positive spirit that seemed impossible under the circumstances. "She talks about you constantly," Sarah said to Thomas. "After that first day at the palace, when you looked at her, it gave her something to hold on to during the really hard days. When she was feeling sick from the chemo, or scared about the next procedure, she would tell herself to be brave like her guard." Thomas felt tears threatening to form as he realized the weight of responsibility that had come with his simple gesture. Emma had invested him with a significance that went far beyond anything he had intended, and somehow that investment had helped her find strength during her most difficult moments. "Can you tell me about what it's like being a guard?" Emma asked eagerly. "I want to know everything: how long you have to stand still, what you think about, whether you get to know the Queen." Thomas spent the next hour answering Emma's questions about his military service, the training required to become a palace guard, and the daily realities of his job. He found himself describing his work in ways he had never articulated before, seeing it through Emma's eyes as something noble and important rather than just a series of protocols and procedures. Emma listened to every detail with rapt attention, asking follow-up questions that showed she understood the complexity and dedication required for his role. She wanted to know about the different uniforms, the significance of various ceremonies, and how the guards coordinated their movements during the changing. Sometimes the most powerful moments happen when someone breaks the rules for all the right reasons. Behind the massive gates of Buckingham Palace, where ancient traditions are followed without question, one guard was about to make a choice that would touch millions of hearts around the world. This is the story of how a simple act of human kindness became a symbol of hope, proving that compassion knows no boundaries, not even the walls of a royal palace. What you're about to hear will remind you that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear tall black hats and stand perfectly still, until the moment when standing still is no longer enough.